Previously on CSIS 2470.
What if I want to find a particular thing about the array? Maybe for whatever weird reason, I want to know the first person in the array who has 4 letters in their name, right? Or whatever. Okay. So in that case, we're going to use the find function. But the next 5 functions we're going to look at, all of them have this same pattern where they take in a callback function, right? Where you can literally put a function right there and it'll run that function, and that function will explain what we're going to try to find, or when we learn about these, what we're going to try to map or filter or reduce or whatever. And so it'll be a callback function. Now you can actually call it by name. So we could have a function called is for length, right? And we'll look at what that looks like in just a second. Or we can, of course, use our friend, the arrow function. And by the way, this is the way you will see it in the industry. So every one of these guys are going to have an arrow function in them, right? And some other things. We'll get back to those in a minute though. So let's get rid of that. And let's look at this find function here, okay? So I'll just leave that there as a note. Let's just start with a simple idea here. Let's make a function called is for length. And it takes in 3 parameters, right? And the 3 parameters are the actual element, which I'm just going to go with E, the index of the element in the array, we'll go with just I, and then the actual array itself. Now you don't actually have to pass these in. It just kind of happens automatically with the way this function works. So let's just start simple, and we'll just look at if the element dot length is not equal to 4, then we'll return false, else we return the element. Okay? I know this looks weird, right? What the find function does is it finds the first instance of it, okay? Notice we have Lars and Kirk, right? Our array looks like this at the moment. Lars and Kirk both have 4 letters. It's only going to find Lars. It's only going to find the first one, okay? So if we put in here Metallica.find, and we're going to pass in is for length, that's going to return Lars. So we can just console.log this. Now, what I'm showing you here is the syntax, and it's a little tricky to wrap your head around why do they do it this way and understanding it. And really the only way to really fully wrap your head around this is the documentation. But I just want to show you the basic idea of how this works, and then I'll show you the arrow function version in just a second. All right, so when we run this, it's going to display all this above content that we've already done, plus it's going to give us, hopefully, Lars. And we refresh, and there you go. These are all the arrays from the previous printouts, and then it gave us Lars. So that's the basic idea. Now, you don't even need these parameters if you're not going to use them in the function here. So if I refresh, we still get Lars, okay? That's one way to do it. I'm going to comment that out, and I'm going to duplicate this and comment that out so you have all of this code now. Now instead, let's do an arrow function here. So this is going to get a little weird. We're going to use a variable to capture the element that we're looking at the moment. So E, again, it could be any letter or any variable, whatever, but E works for element. And then we're going to say return E.length. What this is saying is that if this is true, then return the element. I know it's a little weird, but if you refresh it, you'll see, sure enough, it still returns Lars. Maybe we're looking for 5, right? Well, that should return James, and it does. So I know this is weird, right? That's why I highly recommend you look at the documentation to make sure you really fully understand it. And remember, when you're dealing with arrow functions, you don't even need the parentheses if it only has 1 parameter, right? And you don't need the curly braces or the word return if you're returning just a simple thing like this. Just put it in parentheses and go back to the arrow function discussion in the previous lecture if you're a little unclear on that. But this will work the same. If I refresh it, we still get James, okay? So that's the basic idea of how all of these functions are going to work. The find and all the other ones, the filter, map, and all this. They're going to use an arrow function like this, and we're not going to bother making a function for all of them like we did here, but we'll just use an arrow function, right? So that's it for find. Let's take a look at another one. So find has a buddy, and it's called filter. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to just copy it down here below all of this. Filter is just like find, except filter returns all instances, right? So if I go filter E, where E.length is 5, it will return an array that has all of the things that have length 5, which should be James and Cliff. So let's find out. If I refresh, there we go. We get James and Cliff, and it is an array. And just to be clear, if we console.log Metallica, refresh, the full array is still intact, right? All this did was filter out James and Cliff to give us all of the people that have 5 letters. There's more to the filter array, but that's a good starting point. And again, I just want to show you this syntax here that all of these functions use arrow functions in them. So I'm going to go back to the original arrow function syntax because it's a little more clear in my mind, right? We're going to leave this one with the weird syntax, but this one we're going to put back to arrow function standard syntax, if you will. So return e.length. We'll go back to 4. Okay, that should only will give us Lars, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, what am I missing here? Oh, I'm missing a parenthesis there. So let's fix that. Refresh. And it just gives us Lars and Kirk, the only 2 people with length 4, right? So this is the sort of standard arrow function syntax, right? So that's find and filter. So these next couple are going to take a little bit of a tangent from this little Metallica thing here. These are very common when using numbers, when you have an array of numbers, like maybe a list of scores or points or prices or something like that. So let's go with let scores equal 10, 19, 27. I don't know, it's a dart game or something, who knows. So we have these scores here. The first function we're going to look at is called reduce. All it does is just sum up the total inside of the scores array. So now if we want to total this up, we could do a for loop, or we can use the reduce function. So we can say let total equals scores.reduce. That's the reduce function, reduce. And again, it takes in an arrow function. And there are 2 parameters that we'll use here. One is what they call the accumulator, and it could be any variable you want, but we're just going to use ACC because it makes sense. And then the current value, right, which is the value that you're on, and this is basically like a loop, right? So all we want to do is return the accumulator plus current. That's it. It will know to take this variable here, the accumulator variable, which again could be any variable name you want, and continue adding to it this value here. So if we console that out, total, we should get 70. Refresh, and we get 70. That is the total of all those added up. Now, this function reduce, there are a lot more things you can do with it, and it can get a little tricky, but the basic idea is just how to sum up numbers in an object or in an array in this case. The other one that's kind of a partner-ish to this is the map function, and there are lots of uses for that. What you're doing is making a second array, and it's going to be a modification of the first one. So let's change this from scores. We'll just use these same numbers here. We'll call this let pay equal that. So maybe this is hourly rates for a bunch of people. And now you want to see what it would be like to give everybody 1.5% raise or something like that, or just some sort of a change in their pay or whatever. And you can make a second array that will be that version of it. So it would look something like this. Let new pay equal pay.map. And then we got to do the old arrow function in there. And whatever's in the arrow function, we're going to do some sort of mathematical manipulation on these numbers, and that will be the new array. So let's just say we're going to multiply by 1.5, right? So we just need a variable here that will represent the individual element as we loop through it. Call it x, call it whatever. And then all we're going to do here is say return x times 1.5 or whatever the new pay is going to be. And now let's console.log pay and new pay, right? So let's refresh it. And so here's the original one, 10, 14, 19, 27. And the new one, this would be $15 an hour, $21 an hour, and so on down the line there. And so we've sort of mapped to it, if you will. We've made a relationship that's a mapping that this element maps to an element that's 1.5 times its size. This element maps to an element that's 1.5 times its size, and so forth, based on whatever functionality we put here. All right, let's finish this off with the almighty for each loop. In most programming languages, the for each loop is pretty straightforward. In JavaScript, it's not, which is why I've been using the for of loop in the past. We're going to get into the for each loop, but I want to remind us how the for of loop works first. So what I've done, I've removed all the Metallica stuff here, and I've modified the HTML. What I've done is made a bunch of buttons here, and they each have a color, and then there's an empty div, which gives us this page right here. What I want to do is when I click on red, it's going to change the background of that to red and so forth, right? And I've added a little bit of CSS that I'll give you to style it the way it looks. So here we go. Let's start with the basics. We want to get our hands on that div and all these buttons. So let's just start there. So let div equal document.get element, sorry, not get element, get, how about query selector, there we go, div. That'll grab the div. And then let buttons equal document.query selector all button, and that'll give us an array of all of the buttons. Now in the past we would just loop through that buttons array and use a for of loop, right? You'll recall in a for of loop the first variable here is the iterative variable. That's hard to say. That's the one that's going to change with every loop through that array right there. So we're going to loop through the buttons array. The first time we loop through, we're going to say button is equal to the first button. The second time through, it's equal to the second button, so forth. All right, and then we will do something like button dot add event listener, and then we have the two parameters we need, right? This is pretty standard stuff we've done a bunch of times now. Parameter 1 is the event, which we're going to go with clicks. Parameter 2 is the function, right? Color changer. And then we would often have a function down here called function color changer or whatever, but we're going to do it with an arrow function. We got to get used to that syntax. It's the way that it's done in the industry, and it's the standard practice to do it this way. And even with this syntax that I hate, but this is what you're going to see in the real world. I don't know if I'll be able to make it through by doing it this way. In fact, I already can't. I'm going to put that curly brace down there. That's as close as you're going to get to the real world. That's my version of it. So if you can handle keeping your curly brace up there, go for it. That is what you'll see in the wild, but I got to do it that way. Sorry, folks. Okay, so now let's just do what we would normally do in this situation, right? In the function, we're going to capture the event. So let's get a variable up there to capture that. And then before we can write the code we're going to need, let's just console out that event there, console.log event, right? So when I refresh this here, and we'll go to console and I click red, this is the event right here. And if you'll recall, there's a lot of different pieces to this. And the one we want is the source element. So this source element is the specific button push. As you can see, I highlight over it with my cursor on the right, and it highlights on the left the red. And if I expand that, you can see all of the properties of the button, right? And we have the attributes array inside of there, and it has the data value. And if we come down to the data value, you'll see that its node value is red. So that's the thing we need to capture right there. And we can do that right here. We say e.sourceEvent, that's the button. Then we want the attributes array, and we want the data value, which I think I forgot to show you that. Let me show you what that is right there. Okay, on lines 11 through 15 here, you'll notice I've put a data value attribute with the color. So sorry if I forgot to mention that. All right, so we're capturing that. That's the data value with element. We want the node value. That will be some color, right? So let's go ahead and set this equal to color, and then let's just console out the color. .log color. And so when I click now, refresh, when I click red, I should get red. Oh, we got an error. Let's go take a peek here. And oh yeah, sorry, that should be source element, not source event. Sorry about that. Okay, let's try that again. Refresh, click red, I get red, navy, orange, gold, plum. So that's working perfectly. We're getting the value of the color. Now all we got to do is just change the background color of that div, right? Well, we know how to do that. div.style.backColor equals color. That's it, right? This whole thing is done. Refresh, red, navy, orange, gold, plum. Okay, that's how we would have done this in the past, other than we might not have used this arrow function syntax here, but we would have done this basic idea. Well, let's modify a couple things. Before we get to the for each loop, I'm going to show you one other little trick here. This whole mess here, there's a simpler way to do that. Whenever you use the custom data attribute, you can get a hold of that rather than doing this node value business with just data set dot, and after the dot will be whatever this word right here is, in our case value, so dot value. So let's run it and make sure we didn't break it, refresh, and sure enough everything works. So that saves you from having to dip in the attributes array. I was showing you the attributes array before because that's what you should have learned in 1430, and also it's easier to think through and walk through the DOM and find it. But now I think you're ready for this new version of it, right? So data set, and that's what we will be using moving forward. Okay, this is all groovy here, but this is a for of loop, not a for each loop. So how do we do it in a for each loop? Well, it's very similar. The difference is that for each is a function of arrays, right? The buttons array has a for each method. And remember, we talked about a little bit ago that you pass in an arrow function. This arrow function takes in two parameters. The first parameter is the iterative variable. So above we use the word button, right? We could use that word, or we could just use btn or whatever, but it's the iterative variable. Then the second one is an index. That's one advantage over a for of loop. With the for of loop, I don't have access to the index, whereas with the for each loop, I do. Okay. Now in our case, we're not going to need it, so we could actually leave that off. I'll leave it there for now. And then there's that wonky syntax again. But of course, because of the way my brain works, we have to do it that way. Now remember, what did we do here? We looped through this to add an event listener. So this is going to start to get a little wonky here. So let's just start off with btn.add event listener. And it's going to be the same thing that we did a second ago. Click, and then another arrow function, right? So this is why it can get super messy here. Now, just for a minute, I'm going to put this curly brace back up to the top so you can see how this would look in the real world. And I'm going to do it again right here. And of course, that would be event. And now inside of this event listener, it's going to be this same code here, right? That's not going to change. So I'm just going to steal that from there and put it right there. Okay. And now I'm going to comment all of this out. And so now this is the way a for each loop works and looks in the wild, right? You can see that's kind of messy and it's a little bit hard to wrap your brain around it at first. Let's just run it, make sure we didn't break anything. Click it, and if I click red, navy, orange, gold, plum, it works. And so it's working exactly the same as lines 4 through 11 did, but this is the more common practice that you'll see out in the wild. And again, we have access to the index if we need it. I'm going to get rid of that because you only need to pass in the parameter if you need it, and this still works no problem. Okay. Now I'm going to put it back so that you can remember that it's a thing you can use if you want. So that's the way the for each loop works. Now, if I use it at the very minimum, I'm going to do that. So that's the lovely, fabulous for each loop. That's it for this one, folks. Now, as always, take a look at the questions on the screen. If you can answer the questions on the screen, then you're ready for the quiz. And more importantly, you've learned everything you need to know from this video. Thanks for coming to class, folks. We'll see you next time.